is and shall be yours. But while his desire isn't in question, other aspects of the beginnings of their relationship need to be reassessed. It is widely held that Anne, with whom Henry fell in love in the mid-1520s, was prepared to accept his advances only if he married her and made her his queen. By then, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years, and she had borne him a child, Mary. Though no surviving son, could it be true that Anne suggested to Henry that his marriage to Catherine, widow of his elder brother Arthur, had always been invalid, that it was against divine law, and did she steadfastly refuse to yield to Henry until his marriage to Catherine was annulled, leaving him free to marry Anne? For centuries, historians have reiterated this theory, yet when you look at it closely, it does not make sense. Imagine Anne as a lady of the court who was wanted by the king as his mistress, in a world in which divorce on the grounds of the irretrievable breakdown of a relationship did not exist. Could such a lady realistically hope to persuade Henry to abandon his wife in order to marry her? If Anne did make such demands, would she not be taking the risk that Henry would simply laugh at her and look elsewhere? After all, Catherine was not one of Henry's native subjects, but the aunt of Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. Such a rejection of Catherine would risk serious diplomatic and dynastic consequences. It's much more likely that Anne asked that she should be the king's only mistress, that at least was fully is consistent with the suggestion that it was Henry, not Anne, who refrained from full sexual relations. Now this is a picture here of Catherine of Aragon, depicted in a 16th century portrait. Okay, let's carry on. Our desired end. Henry's love letters support this theory. In one, he informed darling Anne that the letter bearer was being sent with as many things to compass out matter and to bring it to pass as our wits could imagine or devise. Once brought to pass, you and I shall have our desired end, which should be more to my heart's ease and more quietness to my mind than any other thing in the world. Henry's subscription, written with the hand of him which desireth as much to be yours as you do to have him, hints that it was Anne who needed reassurance of Henry's desire, and Henry who was holding back. On another occasion, Henry wrote to Anne, "What joy is it to me to understand of your conformableness in reason, and of the suppressing of your inutile and vain thoughts and fantasies with the bridle of reason." Continue, Henry urged, "for thereby shall come both to you and to me the greatest quietness that may be in the world." Here Henry was urging patience, conformableness to reason on Anne until the church found in his favour. Now, you may have seen this picture as we went past. This is a portrait of Henry VIII. It's dated circa 1525 to 30. Okay. In a letter most likely written soon after Anne agreed to become his mistress, Henry assured her that, "henceforth my heart will be devoted to you only, greatly wanting that my body also could be." Daily he begged God to intervene and help him achieve his goal, hoping that at length his prayer would be heard. Yet in doing so, Henry was not berating Anne for holding back, for refusing to sleep with him. Instead, it was Henry who refrained, and what he regretted were the complexities and the delays imposed by the laws and procedures of the Church. The love letters also reveal that theirs became an intimate relationship. As we have already seen, Henry longed to hold Anne in his arms and kiss her breasts, resorting to force. Henry's armour shows that he was a big man, and we know that he was forceful in emotion. In 1535 he came close to killing his court fool in a rage. If he had wanted to go further with Anne, it is implausible to think that she could have prevented him. From where then did the story arise that Anne was refusing Henry's advances until she was made queen? Perhaps the source was the scholar and cleric Reginald Pole, scope to do that again. But even though Anne Boleyn was by then dead, Henry did not take the opportunity offered by Pole's comments, and we should not treat Pole's remarks as the truth. Nothing in the surviving sources from the late 1520s points to Anne being involved in making the case for the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine. On the contrary, many of the sources suggest that the opposite was true. In one of his love letters,